I'm not used to having like intro music to wait for it to stop. Can everybody hear me in the back? Good? All right, I see thumbs. Welcome. Thanks for having me in Vienna. This is my first time, and so far it's been a really great trip. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. I am from New York. Not the city, a little bit north, but we get like the cool mountains while everyone else gets like rats in the subway. You can find me anywhere online at my handle, Eileen Codes. I also blog at eileencodes.com, like very rarely, but every once in a while, I think, hey, maybe I should write something. I'm a senior systems engineer at GitHub. I work on the app systems team, which is responsible for Rails, Ruby, and other open source libraries and how those interact with the GitHub application. I'm also a member of the Rails core team. For those who are not familiar with the Rails ecosystem, the core team is responsible for setting what the future of Rails is going to look like and making sure that we release new versions and that they're secure and all of the things that you need to do to make sure people still want to use your framework. So today we're going to talk about the unbearable vulnerability of contributing to open source. Before we deep dive into that, I want to give you a bit of background on what I mean by unbearable vulnerability and how that's affected my personal experiences with open source communities. When I talk about vulnerability in open source, I'm specifically referring to contributing to open source and how that exposes our deepest insecurities and makes us feel like we're not good enough to contribute. The vulnerability that we feel when we contribute can inspire us to change the software we use and the communities we belong to, or it can be so unbearable that it's paralyzing because our vulnerability makes us afraid to contribute. I've been contributing to open source for a long time, and I still feel vulnerable, especially when I contribute to a new project or build a large feature. Vulnerability is an inherent part of contributing to open source, and I don't think that feeling will ever fully go away for me. I opened my first pull request on GitHub in 2012. It was a simple PR to fix a typo in a README that I found in a project that I was using. This tiny typo PR was hard for me because I'd never contributed to open source before. I wasn't really sure what to expect. Unfortunately, the PR was never merged because the project had been abandoned for a few years. Almost a full year later, I opened my second pull request on a project called Mini Profiler. One day, while using Mini Profiler in an application, I had noticed that there was this like extra space at the bottom of the page. I thought, oh, this is just a CSS plugin. It's going to be so easy to fix. I quickly found out that it was not CSS, and it took me 2 days to find the invisible UTF-16 character that was causing the display error. Even though I'd spent lots of time on the issue and was confident that I had fixed it, I was still worried that I was wrong and that my contribution wouldn't be accepted and welcome. I felt vulnerable because I didn't know what to expect. I continued to contribute to Mini Profiler and other Ruby libraries, but most of these projects were relatively small code bases. Then in 2014, after giving a talk at Mountain West Ruby Conference, I learned that I'd found a bug in Active Record, which is Rails database manager. Aaron Patterson, a Rails core team member, asked me if I wanted to pair with him to implement a fix for the problem. Shortly after pairing, I opened my first pull request on the Ruby on Rails framework. Even though I had worked with another person and knew the fix was correct, I was still really nervous about opening a PR against a repo where 2,000 people get a notification for every issue PR and comment. I felt vulnerable because I was a new contributor. What if somebody thought my fix was stupid? What if somebody thought I was stupid? These thoughts might seem irrational, but they're embedded in contributing to open source because we're dealing with code, we're dealing with people, not code. However, the other side of that fear is the high you get when your pull request is merged. It felt really good to get my first PR into Rails, and after that, I was hooked. I continued to contribute to Rails regularly after that first pull request. Maybe it was because I had someone mentor me and help me understand Rails internals. Maybe it was just because I had such a good experience contributing that first time. One of the goals of this talk is to provide ways in which you can improve your community so more contributors experience that high instead of the unbearable vulnerability when contributing to your project. Last year, I worked on a large feature for Rails called system tests. Previously, a lot of my work on Rails had been mostly refactoring code, fixing bugs, or improving performance. You know, like all that invisible stuff that nobody really cares about. This was my first experience adding a major feature to Rails. And by major, I mean it was literally the highlight of the Rails 5.1 release. Working on this project reminded me how hard contributing to open source can be. I had been contributing to Rails for over 2 years, but I was really nervous when I opened this PR. I had all of those familiar thoughts and feelings. What if everybody hated the feature? What if somebody thought my code was bad? Even though the creator of Rails had asked me to build the feature, I still had to deal with the reviews, comments, and defend the decisions that I had made in the PR. When I opened the pull request, I had put 3 months of work into it. It was personal to me. I had spent nights and weekends working on it. I became attached to the code and how it worked. In the time the pull request was open, I received over 150 comments and 11 reviews. That's a lot of other opinions to deal with. I felt stressed out and vulnerable, just like I had when I opened my first pull requests. Someone even tweeted about the PR, which only drew more random attention to the work. And don't get me wrong, like, reviews are good and attention is good, but I was drained by the endless bike shedding and nitpicking of details. None of the reviewers meant any harm. They were all just really excited about the feature. Still, a level of discomfort gnawed at me. I was an avid contributor of Rails for 2 years. I had personally released Rails 5, and I had commit rights. Why was opening this PR a nail-biting, stress-inducing event in my life? I figured I'd be over the unbearable vulnerability by now. While I was thinking about this, something occurred to me. I realized that even if we get used to contributing to open source and working with new projects, we can still experience that familiar vulnerability when working on a large feature or contributing to a new repo. The more time we spend on open source, especially free time, the more attached we become to the work that we're doing. And there's only one explanation for why this happens. If contributing to open source was only about writing code, it would be easy. But we all know that contributing to open source isn't easy. We're not just dealing with code or ones and zeros. Nobody would be worried about opening a pull request if open source was just about writing code. So if open source isn't about writing code, that means that open source is really about people. And it's the people that make us feel vulnerable. Contributing to open source is about our insecurities, our fear of being wrong, and our fear of showing our peers our work. Often, just the thought of pushing code to a public repository can cause anxiety. Given that, while people are the source of our vulnerability, they are essential to the open source ecosystem. Let's take a minute to think about what open source would be like if we had no people. Say you write a gem or library and open sourced it. Sure, it's public for anyone to use, but if nobody downloads it, is that really an open source project? Open source doesn't work without users. Otherwise, you're not really sharing your code with anyone. No users means no bug reports, so your work doesn't improve. And if you stop improving it yourself, no one's going to notice because they don't use it. While your code might be public, it's just public code until someone actually uses it. Let's say you have a ton of users, but no contributors. Sure, you get to completely control your project, and you never have to deal with another opinion ever, but is that true open source? If you stop improving the project or move on to something else, your project won't have anyone to take up the burden. Open source can't survive without contributors. Imagine for a moment a world where Matt's created Ruby but never attracted any contributors. Would it be as robust as it is today? Would all of the engineers who learned Ruby be as happy as they are now? Maybe everybody would have adopted PHP instead, but the community and tools would be very different from what they are today if Ruby had never been open source or attracted any contributors. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Ruby, Rails, and their open source success. So I've convinced you that you need people as users and contributors to have a successful open source project. In that case, what are we going to do about the unbearable vulnerability? Vulnerability can be harnessed as a motivator for change, or it can deter us from contributing. There are ways in which we can foster a welcoming community and attract more contributors rather than scare them away. Before we explore ways in which we can make our open source communities better, we're going to look at ways in which maintainers make vulnerability more unbearable. Being vulnerable can be a deterrent for many new and long-time contributors. Feelings of inadequacy can keep folks from contributing to your project, which means that maintainers lose out on changes from other viewpoints that can make their project more robust and usable. We want to avoid creating an environment that fosters fear in favor of an environment that's welcoming and inclusive. We want to create environments and communities that cultivate creativity and inspire contributors. One of the ways in which maintainers deter contributors is by closing pull requests without providing feedback. When maintainers do this, they don't leave room for a contributor to improve in the future. Maintainers should always take the time to explain why a pull request wasn't accepted, otherwise contributors may take it personally. Contributors spend a lot of time and emotional energy contributing, and it could be really demoralizing to not have your pull request accepted. So if you're a maintainer, ask clarifying questions if you don't understand why a change was made or what the use case is. Being dismissive and not giving feedback will cause contributors to feel like their time isn't respected, and they may not contribute again in the future. Another way in which maintainers make contributors feel more vulnerable is through violent communication. An example of violent communication is saying, "This code sucks," or "Did you even try to fix the problem?" This communication style passes the blame onto the contributor and shames them. This will lead contributors to feeling defensive and more vulnerable. It will deter them from contributing to your project in the future because they don't feel like you respect them. It's easy for context to get lost in written communication, so remember to over-communicate with nonviolent techniques to get your points across so that you don't alienate current or future contributors. If you want to learn more about nonviolent communication, you can watch this talk by Nadia called "This Code Sucks, a Story About Nonviolent Communication." Her talk explores what nonviolent communication means and the benefits for using it in your communications at work. Often I see bad behavior being tolerated because someone is a high-impact member of the team, responding to lots of pull requests or setting lots of patches and generally being very involved in your project. Even though a contributor or fellow maintainer may seem like an equal, it seems like an asset, if they're abusive to other contributors, that will deter new contributors from joining your community. It's important to protect your contributors from bad actors and to not tolerate behavior that's exclusive or offensive. This is especially important because of how our dynamic exists between maintainers and contributors in open source. Maintainers inherently have more power than contributors because maintainers decide what gets merged and who gets to contribute. Because of this power dynamic between contributors and maintainers, it's up to maintainers to set and reset the tone of the conversation. There are always going to be assholes who come into your project and demand free time from you, but most people contributing to your project mean well. It takes a lot of time and energy to be mad and rude back to someone. Wouldn't maintaining our projects be easier if we could learn to diffuse stressful situations instead of aggravating them? As a maintainer myself, I've felt the pull to tell people off, trust me. But when that happens, I try to put myself in their shoes and take a walk before responding. They're probably frustrated. Maybe their boss is breathing down their neck to get this fixed. Maybe they just accidentally dropped a production database. Often taking the time to tell the contributor that I know that they're frustrated quickly turns the conversation from defensive to productive. This doesn't mean giving the contributor everything they want. It just means treating them like you want to be treated when you're in a stressful situation. So why is it important to create a welcoming and supportive open source community? Why does it really even matter if contributors don't feel safe being vulnerable? Vulnerability can also be harnessed as a motivator. Being vulnerable isn't necessarily a bad thing. We have all felt it before. Every single maintainer and contributor has at one time felt vulnerable. But when we feel safe being vulnerable, we're more creative, more inspired, and more open. If we can alter our open source communities to be more welcoming and supportive, they'll be more sustainable because the vulnerability will be bearable. It also matters because open source is a funnel. At the top, you have users. Some of those users become contributors, and some of those contributors become maintainers. The more maintainers and contributors your project has, the more sustainable open source is because you have more backup. Making our open source communities more welcoming will attract more contributors and to become maintainers. If we don't make our communities more welcoming, then we'll end up on an island alone, maintaining projects by ourselves. This leads to less users because you can't sustain the project alone, less job offers because no one is using your projects, and less friends because, let's face it, you're spending all of your time working on open source instead of having a life. Imagine a world where instead of burning out on that island, the funnel didn't lose so many potential maintainers. What would the ideal open source world look like? In an ideal world, it might look like users, contributors, and maintainers all moving equally among roles. In today's open source world, many maintainers stop being users of their own product. Some even stop contributing beyond approving and merging pull requests. It doesn't have to be like this, though. But I also think this ideal world is not possible because of how politics work in open source communities. So if this ideal world isn't possible, what is possible? I'd like us to aim to get the funnel to look a little bit more like this. Users are still the majority of people involved in your project, but users are more likely to become contributors and maintainers than in the previous funnel. There's less friction to move between users to contributors and to maintainers and back again. Open source needs contributors. Open source needs maintainers. Without them, open source can't exist and thrive. We need to make open source more sustainable so that people continue to contribute to open source, and this funnel looks a little better. Open source is the present and future of technology, and without it, innovation will stagnate. So how can we create a more welcoming and supportive open source community so that new contributors join and open source communities thrive? There are many ways in which we can make open source a better experience for everyone. Healthy communities benefit maintainers, contributors, and users. One way in which maintainers can attract and retain more contributors is through mentorship. Many of my first contributions to Rails were the result of pairing with Aaron Patterson, a Rails core team member. Mentorships don't need to be official, and they can happen organically. I just met Aaron at a conference, and after my talk, he was like, "Hey, you found a bug in Rails, let's pair on it." Before I made my first contribution to Rails, I never thought I'd be on the Rails core team. Rails is an extremely complicated code base, and it can be really difficult to get used to working on. On top of that, the community is huge. Rails has over 2,000 contributors, and the majority of those people get a notification for every single issue and PR that is opened. It's daunting to work on from a technical and interpersonal standpoint. Aaron and I paired regularly on Rails, which helped me learn faster, feel comfortable, and feel more comfortable contributing. It didn't erase all of my anxiety, but instead of feeling unbearable dread when contributing to Rails, I was mostly excited. Aaron's guidance helped me navigate both the code base and the community, making contributing to Rails less stressful. I knew that he had my back and would help me defend decisions that we made in PRs. Mentoring can happen in many forms, from pairing to email to inviting contributors to a group chat with other maintainers. I've helped folks get their first contribution through Twitter DMs, pairing, email, all sorts of different ways. Mentoring doesn't have to be official or time-consuming. The purpose of mentorship is to act as a guide for your mentee and help them feel more welcome in the community. Mentorship helps your mentee feel supported and gives them a person to bounce ideas off of. Another way maintainers can make open source more sustainable is by writing up clear guidelines for contributing. This helps contributors feel more welcome to your project. It's easier to contribute to a repository that's explained what's expected rather than making someone guess. Each open source project has their own rules for contributing. For example, the Rails project doesn't accept feature requests on the GitHub issues tracker. Other projects are fine with this type of issue, so clearly setting those guidelines for your project will allow contributors to focus on contributing rather than being worried about breaking unspoken rules. Be sure to add a contributing markdown file to your GitHub repository. Include any rules about contributing that are unique to your project, like requiring that all pull requests be a single commit or not allowing cosmetic changes to the code. Another way that you can set guidelines for your contributors is by providing bug report templates. The Rails team provides scripts that can be used to replicate bugs experienced in Rails applications. This means that users don't need to provide us a full application to reproduce the bug that they're experiencing. If a bug can't be reproduced with one of our scripts, then we know it might be a gem or something very specific with their data. These scripts help us triage issues faster because that we can see directly what the behavior is instead of guessing at like what a reproduction is. This helps contributors by reducing the amount of work they need to do to give us a reproduction, so they spend less time stressing out about being potentially wrong. When possible, you should use bots to handle pull request triaging to ensure that contributors don't feel ignored or to give them more information. On the Rails project, we use a bot to auto-assign a pull request to the maintainers. Rails gets so many pull requests that it's hard to give everybody the attention that they deserve. But with the assignment bot, we can focus on what's assigned to us specifically. This helps new contributors know someone is paying attention and will respond to them soon. We also use linters to tell contributors what needs to be fixed, which reduces bike shedding about small details. Nobody wants to argue with a robot. Everyone makes mistakes, so if you see new contributors fail to add CI skip for a documentation change or miss something in your contributing guideline, don't shame them. Kindly tell them how to contribute better in the future. This will ensure that even though the contributor didn't do everything 100% right, they'll still feel welcome to come back and contribute again in the future. There's no point in putting someone down. That will only chase away contributors trying to help you. When you're a maintainer of a project, it's easy to think that you have to do everything yourself. I think it's important to know when and how to ask for help. You can use your README to document areas of your project that needs specific help. When I first started contributing to Mini Profiler, I knew exactly what the maintainer needed help with because he put it all in his README. Contributors will feel more welcome to push changes to your project if they know that the work they're doing is wanted. This reduces vulnerability and stress when opening that initial pull request. Asking for help in your documentation is a great way to get contributors that you need and bring in contributors who are passionate about making sure that your project succeeds. One of the ways that you can ask for help is by promoting contributors to maintainers. Rails wouldn't be successful as it is today if DHH didn't share the burden of making decisions, releasing new versions, and sculpting the future versions of Rails with us. Rails core currently has 12 members. This means that all of us don't need to be available all of the time for Rails to thrive. While smaller projects aren't likely to have this many maintainers, it's important to find contributors that you trust to cultivate the community around your project and help maintain your vision for the code base. Trying to maintain a project by yourself is a fast track to burnout. We can create more sustainable communities if we are nice to and respect everyone. Maintainers set the tone of the conversation, and it's really important to recognize that. Yes, like I said before, assholes will always exist, but the majority of contributors that come into your project, they have good intentions. They want to help you. They're not there to be a jerk. So one of the most important things to remember as a maintainer is to not review pull requests before you've had your morning coffee. If you're like me, you are very grumpy before you've had coffee, and maybe you haven't even recovered from the nightmares that you had the night before. I have personally jumped to snap conclusions when reviewing pull requests before coffee. Often it's more likely that I'll be short with the user and dismiss the pull request without a proper review. Take the time to take care of yourself before reviewing pull requests. Contributors will feel more welcome and won't have to put up with your crabbiness. Being dismissive or rude because you haven't had your coffee can prevent contributors from helping you in the future, which, let's face it, is only going to make you grumpier. As we talked about earlier, employing nonviolent communication tactics is the best way to interact with contributors. You probably should employ nonviolent communication tactics in all areas of your life, but right now we're just talking about open source. Using nonviolent communication will help keep the conversation open. Remember that as a maintainer, you can set the tone of the conversation. Recently, we had a situation on the Rails project where an issue got closed really quickly without a conversation. This, of course, resulted in the contributor getting defensive because we weren't listening to them. I took the time to respond to the contributor and let them know that I understood where they were coming from and asked what solutions would work for them. This immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Instead of being annoyed, we were able to finally talk about what solutions would work. This doesn't mean that the contributor is going to get exactly what they want or that we're going to fix the bug in the way that they need, but they no longer feel like their concerns were ignored or dismissed. Talk to contributors the way you want to be talked to. As a maintainer, you can show that you respect your contributors and future contributors by adding a code of conduct to your project. This will attract new contributors because they know that you're serious about maintaining a professional and respectful community. While codes of conduct benefit everyone, people from underrepresented groups are more likely to feel comfortable and welcome contributing to your project if you implement a code of conduct and ensure all maintainers and contributors treat each other with respect. Maintainers can also use GitHub-provided tools to signal that their community is healthy and welcoming. A great feature that GitHub added late last year is the first-time contributor badge. This badge clearly indicates when contributors are new to your project. When you see this badge, give the contributor a little extra time and be a little extra helpful. When I see this badge, I like to take the time to congratulate the contributor on their first pull request to Rails. As a maintainer of Rails, I want contributors to have a good experience. I want them to know that I value the time they put into their pull requests because I want them to come back and contribute again in the future, because I don't want to fix all the bugs myself. Another GitHub tool that was recently rolled out to everyone is the community profile. The community profile is a tool that shows GitHub's recommended standards for creating a welcoming and sustainable open source community. The community profile is located under the repository insights tab via a link called community. The community profile badge will show you 6 items that make a healthy open source project, which includes a description, a README, code of conduct, contributing guidelines, a license, and issue or PR templates. Each of these items will help make your project more approachable and sustainable. If your community profile is not complete, GitHub provides a wizard that can help you add the missing items like a code of conduct or license, and you can pick one that works for your project. So we've talked a lot about how maintainers can build better communities. All of this is so that new contributors feel welcome and inspired. The goal is to help make vulnerability bearable for contributors. Now we're going to look at ways contributors can find healthy open source communities where their contributions will be welcome. One of the easiest ways to find a project to contribute to is to look at the tools that you use every day. If you build Rails apps, look in your gem file for ideas of projects that might need your help. Contribute to the tools that you use because that's where you're going to be most useful. In open source, users become contributors and contributors become maintainers. So with that logic, the easiest way to become a contributor is to first be a user. A great way to find a community or project that you want to be a part of is to spend some time observing the behavior of the maintainer or other contributors. First, make sure the project is active. Active projects have recent commits. Look at the top bar on GitHub on the repository to see when the last commit was. Projects that are active will have pull requests or merged closed in the last few days to months. My first contribution was for a project that had been abandoned. It didn't feel good to make a contribution that would never be accepted. There are a few ways that you can go about making contributions to projects that might be abandoned. You can offer to take over maintaining the project or open a PR with the understanding that it probably won't get merged. Don't open an issue that asks, is this still maintained, especially when it's obviously not maintained, and 700 other people have opened the same issue. Once you're sure a project is active and accepting new contributors, take a look in the Issues tab for something to work on. Many projects utilize the first good patch or other labels to signal that the issue may be good for new contributors. Usually, these issues require less context in order to fix. This also signals that the community is open to new contributors. Just as most maintainers are volunteers in open source, you're a volunteer too. You don't have to work for free for assholes. If a maintainer or other contributor isn't respectful of you or your time, it's okay to say nope and go work on other open source projects. There are projects that I use in my applications that I won't contribute to because I don't like how the maintainers treat other people and they treat contributors that come into their project. There is no requirement that you voluntarily work on open source projects where maintainers or contributors aren't going to be respectful of you. A big part of contributing to open source is to learn how to accept rejection. I get it, it's really demoralizing to not have your pull request accepted, but maintainers often have a very specific vision for their project, and that's a big reason why pull requests aren't accepted. I've had many pull requests not accepted, and it's not fun, but it's part of open source. Just don't take the rejection personally. It's not about you. Ask for advice how to do better next time, and apply that to future work. Once you do find a community and projects to contribute to, be as respectful to maintainers as you want them to treat you. Hitting a bug in an open source project is frustrating, but maintaining a project is hard too. Most maintainers are volunteers, so while the majority of this talk is about how maintainers can do better, contributors can do better too. Treat maintainers the way you want to be treated if you were a maintainer. There are a ton of resources to help contributors and maintainers have a better experience and build more sustainable communities. First Timers Only, yourfirstpr.github.io, and Code Triage help new contributors find projects that need help and are actively seeking new contributors. Open source guide written by and built by my lovely colleagues at GitHub is a resource for new contributors and maintainers with ideas about building more welcoming communities, finding your first PR, and implementing open source Fridays at your job. Open source isn't about writing code. Open source is really about the people we interact with. It's about our insecurities, our fear of being wrong, our unbearable vulnerability. If contributing to open source was easy, everyone would do it. Toxic communities and maintainers can deter contributors from joining. It's important for us to cultivate and demand better communities because open source simply cannot survive without contributors. We are all responsible for building welcoming open source communities so that it's sustainable and inspirational instead of paralyzing and toxic. There are many ways in which we can improve communities we belong to. Maintainers and seasoned contributors can mentor newcomers, ask for help when we need it, and demand that we all treat each other with respect. Let's build an open source world where instead of ending up on an island alone, burning out from maintaining projects by ourselves, we get to work with bright minds and share ideas in a healthy, sustainable community. The benefits of building a better open source community are endless. Building a more welcoming community will attract more contributors, which makes open source communities more stable. Maintainers and contributors are less likely to burn out because there are more people to share the burden of contributing with, less demand on our time, and more emotional support. Open source environments will be more collaborative and less competitive. Let's build open source communities where less contributors experience unbearable dread when contributing because they're vulnerable and afraid, and more contributors experience that high because they're inspired by their vulnerability to build something amazing for your project. We must work together to create more sustainable open source communities. The future of open source depends on all of us. I hope that the maintainers in this room are inspired to go out and build better open source communities. And I hope those in this room who've never contributed to open source feel inspired to move past their vulnerability and contribute. We all need to respect each other and recognize the vulnerability that everyone needs to overcome in order to contribute to open source. The job of growing these communities doesn't lie solely on one maintainer, one user, or one contributor, or one project's shoulders. The responsibility is all of ours to build the community that we want, whether we're a contributor, a maintainer, or user. Together, we can make sure that open source thrives by building welcoming and sustainable communities. Together, we can make the unbearable vulnerability of open source bearable. Thank you.